Welcome to Windows on the World. Tonight, a very relevant show to what's happening at the moment and also to put history into some kind of perspective. But first, a few headlines. Sky News. Uneasy calm won't last long. Israel's next move could bring even bigger war. On the cards is an Israeli attack on Iran's alleged nuclear weapons facilities. Tehran says it would hit back not just at Israel, but the Gulf states. That would be a very dangerous moment for the region and the world. Israel's critics believe it is trying to clear the entire north of Gaza to make it a closed, occupied zone, something its government refutes. And we've seen a lot of refutations of the facts from the current state of Israel over the last many months. It carries on. To the north, Israel's so-called limited operation in Lebanon looks more like a long-term invasion with each passing day. Expanding into the coastal western sector, its forces have now caught UN peacekeepers in their fire. Israelis say this was a mistake. They were targeting Hezbollah, nestled close to the base of the UN interim force in Lebanon, UNIFIL. And the Times of Israel states, Saudi Arabia condemns in the strongest terms Israel's decision to turn the Jerusalem headquarters of the UN's Palestinian Refugee Agency into apartments. Last week, the Israel Land Authority said it was preparing plans to turn the Malot Dafina complex into 1,444 housing units after telling UNRWA it must evacuate the premises. The Saudi Foreign Ministry notes in an English language statement, the kingdom's rejection of the continued blatant Israeli violations of international laws and resolutions and its systematic political and military targeting of the United Nations agencies and its relief organisations. Over to Reuters now. France, Italy and Spain condemn targeting of UNIFIL by the IDF. The leaders of France, Italy and Spain on Friday condemned the recent targeting of the UN peacekeeping mission in Lebanon, known as UNIFIL, by the Israeli Defence Forces and said such attacks were unjustifiable and should immediately come to an end. The IDF knew exactly what they were doing and could not have mistaken the UN post for anything else. Removing witnesses to war crimes by killing peacekeeper observers is not a good strategy. It is actually no strategy at all, and that forms the context for tonight's show. The world is turning against Israel, but is it part of a bigger plan? Has time run out for the modern state of Israel? We're going to talk about land and resources. The nation state is said to be the measure of all things. The homeland, a legal entity which can pass laws and have status internationally with of course, other legal entities. When a group become exiled, they are at the mercy of foreigners. From a global viewpoint, the modern-day state of Israel is now a problem. It appears that it is being allowed to destroy itself, and it appears that this could have been the plan from its inception. Israel, now a nation-state, was populated firstly by mainly illegal immigrants from Russia, known as the first waves of the Aliyah, the return home. As Chaim Berman stated in his 1977 book Israel, Israel was not a place those identifying as Jews needed to go. It was a place they could go if they wanted. Therefore, Israel was an ideology and attracted ideologists. Of course, the Zionists had turned down a state in Africa in Madagascar. The official internet source actually states, in 1905, a delegation sent to inspect the plateau found it to be dangerous, filled with lions and other creatures. It was the native population they also feared, as the Maasai were not favourable to foreigners either. Of course, the idealists of Zionism wanted the modern-day Jerusalem and believed the story they had adopted through religious belief. Egypt, Iraq, Syria and Lebanon were experiencing sovereignty by 1936, and the Arabs in Palestine wanted their own independence. They certainly did not want any notion of a national Jewish homeland in their home. By 1936, the influx of Jewish illegal immigrants into Palestine had increased massively. Over 40,000 in 1934 and 60,000 in 1935. The British went some way in mediating with the Arabs in trying to restrict illegal immigration and the appropriation of land, often by underhand means or by any means possible, of the Palestinian land. And this was not popular with the Jewish Agency in Palestine. So what we're looking at here is the British as mediators, and we're going to get into the story of Israel and really what happened when it began to grow as a nation state. So let us go back to that formation period and compare it with now to get an overview. Today, Israel is acting in much the same way as Avraham Stern, a Polish immigrant who believed that the Palestinians had no status in Palestine and that the new state in Palestine called Israel was his homeland and was solely for Zionists. It never occurred to this Polish immigrant that his nation state was Poland and the Palestinian nation state should be Palestine. And such was the fervour and the zealous separatist apartheid and idealism of Zionism. Well, Avraham Stern and his group believed that all Jews were Zionists and only Zionists should exist in Palestine, or what is now called the modern-day State of Israel, founded, of course, in 1948. Avraham Stern came to Israel in 1925 and he became an outstanding student in humanities. He joined a militant group called the Haganah. The Haganah was established in June 1920 by the Labour Zionist Party in response to the Arab riots of 1920 and 1921. The word Haganah is Hebrew for defence. Now we often see this coming up with Israel using the word defence when they are in fact attacking. And Netanyahu's speeches are full of this kind of rhetoric. And of course, there is the allegation of anti-Semitism when anybody criticises what the modern-day state of Israel is doing. Well, Haganah were too much a mediator group for Avraham Stern, as they sometimes collaborated with the British, who he had defined as the enemy along with all Palestinians. So Avraham Stern, a very radical Zionist, had defined the British as the enemy along with the Palestinians. And Stern was notable for his fanaticism in the armed struggle for Jewish independence, which he believed could succeed only if conducted by an underground force independent of all legal bodies. So in effect, Stern was a revolutionary inspired by fanaticism. In 1931, a group of Haganah fighters, rejecting what they deemed was moderation and restraint in the fight for Jewish independence, broke away from the Haganah and they formed this armed resistance movement of their own known as the Irgun. And Stern, whose views had become much more militant following the Arab riots of 1929, became an active member of the Irgun. He took on the underground name of Yair, in tribute to the commander of the Zealots at Masada, Eliezer ben Yair. Now this is interesting because Zionism revolves around religious belief, and that is going to be very important in tonight's show. So in 1934, Stern was sent by the Irgun on missions to Poland and other European countries to purchase weapons and also to arrange for their shipment to Israel. In 1935, he obtained the first two Finnish-made machine guns and shipping them in double-sided boilers over to Israel. Other weapons were transported in suitcases and crates belonging to immigrants going into Israel. Now, of course, we have to remember that the immigrants went from Russia to Cyprus, then to Israel, as did the arms. So Stern viewed the British, more than the Arabs, as the primary enemy of the Jews and the principal obstacle to Jewish independence. He advocated an armed struggle against the British. With David Raziel, he compiled a manual on the use of the revolver, the first of its kind to be printed in Hebrew. In 1933, he wrote the poem Anonymous Soldiers, which became the anthem, first of the Irgun and later of the Lehi. A collection of Stern's underground poetry, most relating to dedication and self-sacrifice and this longing for a sovereign Israel, was published after his death. So Stern concluded an agreement with the Polish government in 1938, and arms acquisitions were accelerated. The weapons were transferred under Polish army supervision to Irgun warehouses in Warsaw and then shipped to Israel. The Stern Gang actually robbed banks to fund their operation and also killed people who got in their way. They became very unpopular to the supporters of Haganah and also to most Jews at the time. Vladimir Jabotinsky, who was born in 1880 in Odessa in Russia, which is now in Ukraine, and Menachem Begin were leaders in the Irgun and had decided there would be no war with Britain until the end of the Second World War. The massacres of Palestinians continued, however, including the Deir Yassin massacre and many more, which were in fact worse, where whole villages were wiped out, whole Palestinian villages. So the Stern Gang were responsible for the bombing of the police station in Tel Aviv with a device that exploded in a truck, killing several people. In 1939, the British police in Palestine actually captured leaders of the Irgun the day before World War II started. Well, Avraham Stern's motto was, "My enemy's enemy is my friend." Stern had wanted to form alliances with Hitler against the British. He believed that Jews should be forced to return to Israel and that the Nazis would assist in this. His offer was sent to the German embassy in Beirut, but there was never a reply. Stern wanted Jews out of Germany and thought that Hitler would help him. Both Stern and Ben-Gurion had also been fascinated by Italian fascism, and Ben-Gurion had met fascists in Italy. It was hoped that the Jerusalem Agreement to dissolve the diaspora of Jews would help to force the Jews into Palestine. And what has to be remembered is that the middle-class Jews in Europe and America were generally settled, and it was illegal immigrants and Zionist idealists who were first on the soil of the new state of Israel. Exchanging the comfortable life in New York or London for a dangerous desert area was not at all attractive. Stern's messages to the Italian fascists were actually intercepted. In fact, he had inadvertently been communicating with the Irgun, who were also his rivals, of course, and the Palestinian leader had already met with Hitler by this time. The massacre at Deir Yassin escalated the exodus of Palestinians as all three militant groups, the Haganah, the Irgun and the Lehi, were all involved in a show of Zionist solidarity. The Arab War of 1948 was used to expel even more Palestinians. Land was taken which was stated to be abandoned and others forced off their land. It had been also the method of General Ord Wingate fighting for the British, who was a devout Zionist. And his idea was the precautionary principle of killing Palestinians in their beds before they could become terrorists. This was the antidote to any resistance. And by now the State of Israel was embarked in its ongoing ethnic cleansing and appropriation of all Palestinian land. Well, the capture of Avraham Stern was by pure chance. It was through two injured soldiers in a Haifa hospital. One of the wives of the soldiers was harbouring Stern in her apartment, and this slipped out in a conversation in the hospital. British Army officer Thomas Wilkin apprehended Avraham Stern, and he was then shot dead by Major Morton on the 12th of February 1942 at the age of 34. In 1948, the defining message of Stern's revolutionary Zionism came about in the bombing of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. The British administrative headquarters for Mandatory Palestine was housed in the southern wing of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem and was bombed in a terrorist attack on 22nd of July 1946 by the militant right-wing Zionist underground organisation Irgun. During the Jewish insurgency, 91 people of various nationalities were killed, including Arabs, Britons and Jews, and 46 were injured. So the King David Hotel massacre, where Jews dressed as Arabs and blew up the hotel, was a defining moment, and it was really the outcome of the revolutionary Zionism of the likes of Avraham Stern. The hotel was the site of the central offices of the British Mandatory Authorities of Palestine, principally the Secretariat of the Government of Palestine and the headquarters of the British Armed Forces in Palestine and Transjordan. So this was an attack at the heart of Britain and Palestine. When planned, the attack had the approval of the Haganah, the principal Jewish paramilitary group in Palestine, though unbeknownst to the Irgun, this had been cancelled by the time the operation was carried out. So in other words, the Haganah did not want to be involved. At the last minute, they wanted to pull out, but it was too late. The main motive of the bombing was to destroy documents incriminating the Jewish agency in attacks against the British, which were obtained during Operation Agatha, a series of raids by Mandate authorities. It was the deadliest attack directed at the British during the Mandate era between 1920 and 1948. And it was carried out by Israelis disguised as Arab workmen and as hotel waiters. Members of the Irgun planted a bomb in the basement of the main building of the hotel, whose southern wing housed the Mandate Secretariat and a few offices of the British military headquarters. The resulting explosion caused the collapse of the western half of the southern wing of the hotel. You can see photographs of it if you look on the internet. Destroyed half the hotel. Some of the deaths and injuries occurred in the road outside the hotel and in adjacent buildings. It was a massive explosion. And people are still quite proud of this to this day. There is reports of the bombs being escorted there in milk churns. And you can find all of this with a couple of clicks of your mouse. Well, the official soundbite is, in November 1947, the United Nations recommended the partition of Palestine and the establishment of separate Arab and Jewish states. On the 15th of May 1948, Britain gave up her mandate and the British Army officially departed from Palestine. But the ideology of Avraham Stern lives on in Israel today. It is not expressed outright, but in the actions of the Israeli state. In 1948, when members of the Jewish underground organisation Lehi killed UN peace mediator Count Folke Bernadotte in response to his diplomatic efforts to modify the Palestinian partition plan, there was outrage. Bernadotte was a Swede with family ties to the Swedish king and gained international recognition through his work as head of the Swedish Red Cross during World War II. Bernadotte used his position to negotiate with Heinrich Himmler and save thousands of Jews from the concentration camps. So this was a move that was really unpopular with a lot of the newly formed population of Israel. So we can see now the extremist Zionists were not representative of many of the people who were now populating the state of Israel. It was Yitzhak Shamir, who was twice Prime Minister of Israel, that ordered this assassination. And today, the Zionist elitists still maintain they speak on behalf of all Jews. So I hope this is illuminating. I'm going to have a short break and I'll be back in a couple of minutes. Welcome back to Windows on the World, and I forgot to make an announcement at the beginning of the show. The announcement is for anybody who supports the show directly into my bank account. We get some people who have joined a thing called the £5 a month club. Now, what's happened over the last week is that the bank that I'm currently with is no longer viable. I was using an internet bank and it has become very unreliable. So I'm going to have to change my bank details. So if you do contribute to the £5 a month club, please email me at info@windowsontheworld.net and I will send you my new bank details. And thanks to everyone who supports the shows. It makes a big difference, and we're going to have to be paying out quite a lot more for streaming over the next 12 months. So do try and support the shows, and it really does help to keep things going. There are quite a lot of expenses involved in all of this, and of course my time, which I give you all for free. But we won't get into any grifting, because we don't do that sort of thing on Windows on the World. It's all about trust and respect. So let's get back to what we're talking about. Let's talk about today. Well, today Israel is not united within its own boundaries and against its own perceived enemies. And the whole future of the state of Israel, in effect, is hanging in the balance. With Israel declaring war with its neighbours and now openly wiping out the rest of Palestine, the beliefs of Avraham Stern are still evident in the actions of Israel. It is now clear that Netanyahu is blindly leading Israel into total destruction, and the arrogance and neurosis evident in his speech at the UN shows he is oblivious to the world's leaders turning against him. This is from Middle East Monitor, September the 28th, 2024. Delegates walked out as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was called to address the UN General Assembly's 79th session yesterday. Tel Aviv has continued what UN experts have called a genocidal war on Gaza for almost a year, killing over 41,500 Palestinians, and this week launched its biggest bombing campaign on Lebanon in almost 20 years, killing more than 700 people. UN calls for a ceasefire have failed to stop the US-backed attacks, which Netanyahu has vowed to continue. And if you listen to what he said in the UN, he's basically stating that America will always stand with Israel. And during the speech, Netanyahu made reference to Moses and his people, a false argument and a misdirection under the circumstances. And we're going to get into that, because the only thing that Zionism seems to have left is this appeal to religiosity. Having a few supporters brought in to clap at everything he says at the UN was contrasted, of course, by the empty seats of those who walked out. Well, Netanyahu's ludicrous and transparent showing of two maps on bits of card labelled the blessing and the curse, the blessing was a transparent cover for Greater Israel. And this was only usurped by the time he showed a picture of a cartoon bomb with a fuse when referring to Iran's nuclear programme. That was in 2012. And let's just read what it said about that, because people may have forgotten. This is from the UK Guardian, Thursday, 27th of September 2012. In his speech to the UN General Assembly, the Israeli Prime Minister adopted the persona of an elementary school science teacher talking to a particularly dim class to explain Iran's nuclear programme and the point at which it must be stopped. Having incessantly talked about red lines for the past few weeks, he literally drew one across the picture of a bomb to illustrate the point at which the international community should take decisive action. Netanyahu set his literal red line at the 90% threshold of uranium enrichment, a point which he said could be reached by next spring or summer. Now, if you see this, you can actually look up that article from The Guardian or look it up on the internet. Just put in Netanyahu holds up bomb in 2012 at the conference. And it's almost comedic. It's like the bomb that you see in a cartoon. It's a big round thing with a fuse coming out of it. But there was never any possibility that Netanyahu would stop and think or adopt a strategy which would appease international leaders. It's never going to happen. The rhetoric is as self-destructive as that of Avraham Stern, but as a statesman, Netanyahu should be eons ahead of such self-destructive megalomania, and of course he isn't. On a global governance level, it appears that the temperament of Israel's Prime Minister and its Greater Israel plan is being exploited for a secondary purpose. The higher purpose could be the end of the State of Israel, Could it be that Israel is about to destroy itself for globalist objectives? And was this the plan all along? The study and knowledge of behaviour of groups, of course, is essential to the art of war. Israel, it appears, has no strategy. It behaves like a spoiled child, retaliating to everything in a transparent, narcissistic and visibly ugly way, and then, of course, denying everything it is accused of. There is no consideration of action. Israel's opponents and ultimately its controllers also know this. And I believe from my research that they've known this for a very, very, very long time. So nothing else apart from this seems to make sense, with Israel being allowed to go as far as it is going and hurtling in what appears to be self-destruction. Israel's opponents and ultimately its controllers, I think, do know this. Well, nothing else makes sense. Will the world allow what is going on to continue? It doesn't appear so. Killing UN border peacekeepers in Lebanon so the world cannot see what you're doing appears from the outside to be more and more neurotic and insane as a strategy, as is everything that Israel has engaged in since October the 7th. This is from an outside perspective. But when the IDF commit war crimes and put the footage on Facebook, it's clear that there is a blind arrogance and pathological hatred of the Palestinians, and it's there for all the world to see. All the footage, including the bombing of apartment blocks, and just to see the explosions this was, blowing up apartments and saying, "We love explosions" on Facebook, and IDF soldiers mocking their victims while also wearing the underwear of Palestinian women and even displaying their torture victims on Facebook, has been enthusiastically uploaded with pride and chutzpah. And it's all in a documentary that's been made by Al Jazeera. So the IDF have uploaded evidence of their own war crimes under their own names so they can be individually prosecuted. This is beyond what anybody would think possible in a war zone. And it's only the thing that you would expect from paid, undisciplined and criminal mercenaries. They don't seem to understand that this sort of deranged and evil mockery of what are in effect victims is not acceptable to most, and more importantly, it's a war crime. Why would the IDF command even allow this to happen? Would any other army in the world be so strategically ignorant as to show off its war crimes on social media? This is the sort of behaviour of out-of-control mercenaries, as I've just said. And everyone can look up the war crimes and illegal actions of the Israeli state, but flaunting them on social media is only comparable to psychopathy. In other words, to be in denial of all one's criminal actions and to be completely unaware of the repercussions or consequences. And the real question is, I suppose, has the modern-day state of Israel, which was bankrolled by Lord Rothschild, fulfilled its purpose as a strategic asset in the Middle East? It seems intent on destroying itself, but on the other hand, unaware that it will. Pride comes, of course, before a fall. This could, of course, be the catalyst to a third world war. Either way, it appears from a globalist perspective that the modern state of Israel may be coming to an end. So, is the only story left to use a religious one, that of a lost tribe relying on its own interpretation of its own invented history? And was the relocating of Israel by Constantine to the Middle East in 325 AD taken into consideration when constructing this modern-day state in 1948? That's something I've been thinking more and more about, and something that seems to make more and more sense. So, the two lies of for and against Israeli expansion are now irrelevant. And what Netanyahu seemingly does not and cannot understand is that Israel are most likely themselves just pawns in the game. I'm going to finish off this show reading from the end of Chaim Berman's book Israel, published in 1967. It concludes, "Yet if Zionism is to continue to have an appeal, one cannot see how it can be anything other than religious. Nor can the Arabs' case that Israel has usurped their homeland be answered in anything other than religious terms. How else may one justify the annexation of the old city of Jerusalem? Israel is in fact a religious state, almost in spite of herself. The ruling parties may be dominated by secularists, but when the Wailing Wall was taken, Ben-Gurion, who was about as much at home in a place of worship as a bishop in a casino, went rushing to it, as did Moshe Dayan and Levi Eshkol. Here they were at the source of what it means to be a Jew and what the Jewish state was about. And he also says at the end of this book, fascinatingly, nationalism is a waning force in the West, and it will wane in Israel once she is secure in her frontiers. Well, obviously, the modern day state of Israel has not taken that advice and is never going to. A very interesting conclusion to his book. And he finishes by saying, there is a passage in the book of Micah which embodies the ultimate aspirations of religious Zionism. But in the end of days it shall come to pass that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established at the top of the mountains, and it shall be exalted above the hills, and people shall flow into it. And many nations shall go and say, Come ye, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, and to the house of the God of Jacob. And he will teach us his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And he finishes by saying, while there is the insistence that the ossified code inherited from exile is the true law, there can be no renaissance, nor any hope that the prophetic role of Zion will be fulfilled. And that concludes a fascinating book by Chaim Bermant, a Lithuanian Jew who was the editor of the Jewish Chronicle at the time. I hope you found that interesting, because a lot of people actually don't know the basics of the history of Israel, and the comparison of today's state of Israel with the idealism of Abraham Stern, I think, is quite fascinating and very relevant. So, if you want to support the show, please do, and info@windowsontheworld.net if you would like to rejoin the new £5 a month club, because I have changed my bank. So thanks to all of those supporters, and keep sending in the information. That's it from Windows on the World.